The restaurant was buzzing with laughter, clinking glasses, and the soft hum of conversation. The air smelled of roasted meats, fresh bread, and expensive perfumes. Waiters moved quickly between tables, balancing plates, pouring wine, and smiling politely at every guest. Among them was David, a young black waiter with calm eyes and steady hands. Today, he was serving a special table, a group of wealthy Chinese businessmen celebrating some unknown success. From the moment he approached, one man stood out. He wore a sharp suit, a gold watch, and an expression that seemed to mock the world. The other guests laughed nervously at his jokes. But David noticed the way this billionaire's eyes lingered on him. Sizing him up, "Bring me the wine quickly," the man snapped in a harsh tone, his voice cutting through the chatter. David bowed slightly and moved with professional calm. He knew the routine. He had served rich, rude people before. But something in the man's gaze made the usual patience feel like a challenge. The billionaire leaned back in his chair, swirling his glass of red wine. "Ah, look at you," he said loudly, pointing at David. "You don't even speak properly, do you?" He laughed loudly, a sound meant to humiliate. Other guests joined in, chuckling and glancing at David. David's heart did not race, though a flicker of tension passed through him. He kept his face neutral, hiding the storm of thoughts behind a polite smile. He poured the wine carefully, making sure not to spill a drop. "Here is your wine, sir," he said softly. His voice was even almost calm, but carried a weight that only careful ears could sense. The billionaire was not satisfied. "Ha ha ha, you think you are clever, waiter? You look like you barely know anything. Tell me, can you even understand me?" He leaned forward, his laughter now sharp and cruel. The table of guests erupted with louder laughter, some pointing at David. For a moment, the room seemed to shrink. Every eye was on him. The sound of laughter felt heavy, almost suffocating. David's hands were steady, but inside, he felt the sting of humiliation. This was more than just a rude comment. It was a public display meant to belittle him, to make everyone see him as small. Yet, behind his calm expression, David's mind worked quickly. He remembered all the years he had studied, the languages he had secretly practiced, and the skills he had quietly perfected while serving tables and enduring insults. He had been ready for moments like this, though he had never imagined it would come in front of such a rich, arrogant man. The billionaire's laughter grew louder. "Can he even speak?" He mocked again. "Maybe we need someone who can at least pronounce our words properly." He gestured dramatically, and the crowd laughed even harder. David's chest tightened, but he did not falter. He held the tray of food with both hands, bowed slightly, and left the table without a word. The kitchen door slammed behind him, and he leaned against the wall for a brief moment, closing his eyes. He could hear the faint echo of laughter from the dining hall. But beneath the sting of humiliation, a small smile formed on his lips, a quiet, confident smile. This was not the end. Something was about to happen, something the billionaire would never see coming. David straightened his uniform, brushed off his nerves, and walked back toward the table. Every step was calm, measured, and filled with quiet determination. The room remained filled with chatter and laughter, but the tension was building. The audience could sense it, something extraordinary was about to unfold. And in that moment, as he approached the billionaire once again, the waiter's eyes held a secret that no one could guess. Everyone laughed, mocking him openly, but the real story was just beginning. David stepped into the kitchen, the door closing behind him with a soft click. The bustling noise of the dining room seemed to shrink into a distant echo. He leaned against the wall for a moment, breathing slowly, letting the tension slide from his shoulders. The laughter from the billionaire's table still echoed faintly, but this time, it no longer felt heavy, it felt like fuel. He wiped his hands on his apron and looked around. The kitchen was filled with the usual chaos, sizzling pans, clattering dishes, and the chatter of other staff. But David barely noticed any of it. His mind was focused, replaying every detail of the table outside. Every word, every laugh, every mocking gesture. A young chef, curious, approached him. "You okay, David?" she asked nervously. He was so rude. I mean, everyone saw it. David smiled faintly, almost like a secret only he knew. "I'm fine," he said. His voice was calm, controlled, like water flowing over rocks. Sometimes people show who they really are when they laugh at someone else. The chef frowned, unsure what he meant. David didn't explain. He only closed his eyes for a moment, remembering something long buried in his memory. Years ago, before he became a waiter, he had always loved languages. He had spent nights quietly studying Chinese, practicing tones and phrases while the world slept. At first, it was just a hobby, a challenge to himself. But over time, he became good, very good. No one at the restaurant knew. No one had ever suspected it. It was his hidden skill, tucked away behind polite smiles and trays of food, and now it was about to be used. David opened his eyes and straightened his posture. The kitchen staff watched him curiously. There was a new energy in his step, a quiet confidence that didn't need to be shouted. He could feel it building inside, like a storm ready to break. He picked up a tray and adjusted it, walking slowly back toward the dining room. The clatter of the kitchen faded behind him, replaced by the low hum of chatter from the guests. He paused just outside the door, taking one last deep breath. His heart was steady. His mind was sharp. He was ready. As he stepped back into the restaurant, he noticed the billionaire leaning back in his chair, laughing again, completely unaware. The guests were still smiling, some whispering among themselves about the young waiter. But David's eyes were fixed on the table. Every detail, the gold watch, the expensive suit, the smug smile was burned into his memory. He walked closer, slowly, deliberately. Each step was measured. The crowd barely noticed him at first, too caught up in their own amusement. But then, as he reached the table, the room seemed to pause for just a moment. Something about his calm, confident demeanor made the laughter quiet. David bowed slightly, tray in hand, and then set it down. "Excuse me, sir," he said softly. His voice was low, polite, almost unassuming. But there was a subtle weight to it, a quiet authority that made the billionaire stop mid-laugh. For a moment, no one moved. The room was still, the air thick with anticipation. The young waiter's calm eyes met the billionaire's. Behind that quiet expression, a storm was gathering, a storm no one at the table could see coming. David smiled faintly, almost imperceptibly. He didn't speak yet. He let the silence stretch, letting the billionaire feel the sudden shift in power. The laughter from the table had faded. The guests were curious, leaning forward in their chairs, sensing that something extraordinary was about to unfold. And then, David opened his mouth. Not in English, not in the language everyone expected, but in fluent, perfect Chinese. The words were sharp, clever, and polite, but they carried a weight that made the billionaire freeze. The entire table fell silent. The guests exchanged shocked glances. No one had expected this. The young waiter, once mocked and laughed at, now held the room's attention with nothing but words. The calm before the storm had ended. Now the storm was coming. The room was quiet now, a silence heavier than the laughter that had filled it moments ago. Every eye was on David, the young black waiter who had just returned to the billionaire's table. The clinking of glasses and soft murmur of the other guests seemed to vanish, replaced by a curious, tense anticipation. The billionaire leaned back in his chair, smirking, as if waiting for David to stumble. "Well," he said, voice sharp, full of mockery. "What will you say, little man? Or have you forgotten your words?" His laughter had a cruel edge, but now it sounded forced. Unsure. David stood straight, his hands clasped lightly in front of him, eyes calm and steady. No tremor, no nervous twitch betrayed him. He took a slow breath, letting the tension stretch. The guests shifted in their seats, some whispering to each other. They sensed that something was about to happen, but no one knew what. Then, David spoke, not in English, not in broken words, but in perfect, fluent Chinese. His voice was clear, polite, and confident. "Sir," he said, "you have laughed at me and spoken to me with disrespect. Yet I serve you still. Tell me, is this how a man earns respect?" For a heartbeat, no one moved. The billionaire's eyes widened. He stared at David, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The other guests leaned forward, shock spreading across their faces. Whispers turned into murmurs. David continued, each word deliberate. "I speak your language, yet you chose to mock me. Does wealth give a man the right to belittle others?" His tone was calm, almost gentle, but every word carried a sharp, cutting edge. The billionaire's face drained of color. He opened his mouth to respond, but no sound came out. The crowd at the table had gone completely silent, their earlier laughter replaced with stunned attention. The power had shifted. The young waiter, who moments ago had been mocked and humiliated, now commanded the room with nothing but his words. Some guests exchanged glances, whispering, "Did he just speak Chinese? And he knows their language?" They were astonished. David's knowledge, his hidden skill, had turned the tables completely. The billionaire finally found his voice, stammering. I didn't expect. I mean, how?" David interrupted gently but firmly. "Respect is not bought with money. It is earned through action, honesty, and integrity. A man who mocks others has already shown his weakness." The billionaire's smirk vanished. For the first time, he felt small. The people around the table, who had once laughed at David, now looked at him with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. The waiter's calm confidence, his unexpected skill, and his clever words had left the entire room stunned. David lowered his gaze slightly, not arrogantly, but with dignity. He waited, letting the message sink in. Every eye in the restaurant followed him, sensing the shift of power. The billionaire's arrogance, once so loud, now seemed fragile. A few guests began to whisper quietly to each other. Some shook their heads, smiling slightly, realizing they had misjudged the young waiter. David had shown that intelligence and skill could outweigh wealth and status. The lesson was clear: never underestimate someone quietly preparing behind the scenes. The billionaire, still struggling to regain his composure, finally forced a smile, but it was weak, unsure. David nodded politely, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. And yet, everyone watching knew something extraordinary had just unfolded. The young waiter's calm, measured approach, his knowledge of the language, and his courage to stand tall had transformed humiliation into triumph. What had begun as mockery was now a lesson in humility, and the crowd had witnessed it all. The unexpected twist was complete. The joke was no longer on David, it was on the billionaire. And the room would never forget the moment the quiet, respectful waiter spoke words no one expected, leaving everyone in shock and awe. The room was completely silent. Even the faint clinking of cutlery from other tables seemed to vanish. All eyes were on the billionaire and David, the young black waiter who had just stunned everyone with his flawless Chinese. The billionaire's face was pale. His smug arrogance had been replaced by disbelief. He had expected laughter, obedience, and servitude. Instead, he was faced with calm intelligence, a quiet power that he had never anticipated. David stood straight, hands lightly clasped, eyes steady. He did not raise his voice. He did not shout. Yet every word he had spoken carried weight. The billionaire shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing around at the guests, as if searching for support. But the guests were no longer laughing. Some were whispering, others were staring, their expressions a mix of shock and admiration. What? How do you? The billionaire stammered, unable to form a coherent sentence. His pride, built on years of wealth and status, wavered under the unexpected challenge. For the first time, he felt small. David's expression remained calm, almost serene. He leaned slightly forward and spoke again, politely, yet firmly. "Sir, respect is universal. Wealth cannot buy it, nor can arrogance command it. When you mocked me, you underestimated someone who has spent years learning, preparing, and improving. That is not weakness. That is strength." The billionaire's jaw tightened. He tried to laugh it off, but the sound was hollow, forced, and weak. The crowd at the table exchanged glances. Realizing that the young waiter had not only defended himself, but had completely turned the situation around, a few guests whispered under their breath, "He's brilliant. And I can't believe he spoke like that." The energy in the room shifted. What had been mockery and laughter had now become respect and admiration. The young waiter, once laughed at, had captured the attention of every guest. The billionaire tried again, voice faltering. I didn't expect anyone." He trailed off, unable to finish. His usual confidence, his sense of control, was gone. The room seemed to close in on him, filled with the silent judgment of onlookers who had once joined in mocking. David's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the billionaire's unease. Every gesture, every word, reinforced the truth. Intelligence, preparation, and dignity can overpower arrogance, no matter how wealthy the person is. A subtle shift occurred in the room. The guests, who had earlier been passive observers, began nodding slightly, acknowledging David's courage and wit. Some even smiled quietly, realizing that true respect does not come from status, but from character. The billionaire's face, still flushed, betrayed a mixture of embarrassment and reluctant admiration. He had been bested, not with anger, not with force, but with knowledge and composure. The waiter had transformed humiliation into a display of strength. Leaving the arrogant man speechless, David bowed slightly, politely, and with a calm, almost imperceptible smile, he said in English, "It is never too late to learn humility, sir." His tone was soft, gentle, yet each word struck like a quiet hammer, leaving the billionaire with no comeback. The room remained silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, a few guests began clapping, almost hesitantly at first. But the applause grew, filling the restaurant. It was not just for the young waiter, it was for justice, courage, and intelligence. David had earned it without raising his voice or fighting back physically. The billionaire, still seated, realized that his mockery had failed spectacularly. The power he believed he had over others was an illusion. The waiter's knowledge, patience, and dignity had shattered it completely. For the first time in years, the billionaire felt the sting of humility. And David? He simply stood, calm, dignified, and unshaken. The shock had passed. The lesson had been delivered. The room would never forget this moment. The billionaire sat frozen, his smug arrogance evaporated like mist in sunlight. The guests at the table, who had once laughed and whispered insults, now watched in awe. Every eye in the restaurant seemed to follow David. The young black waiter, whose calm demeanor and flawless Chinese had completely changed the mood of the room. David took a slow step forward, his eyes scanning the table, not with anger, but with quiet intelligence. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't point fingers. His presence alone commanded attention. The subtle smile on his lips hinted at the cleverness waiting to unfold. "You have wealth," David began, speaking fluently in Chinese once more. "You can buy anything but respect. That cannot be purchased. It must be earned. And yet, you chose to mock someone who serves you. Why?" The billionaire's mouth opened and closed. He had no words. His usual confidence was gone. The guests were leaning in, straining to hear every syllable. Some whispered among themselves, "He's teaching him a lesson in his own language, and wow, what courage." David continued, his voice calm, steady, and deliberate. A man's worth is not measured by his money or power. It is measured by his character, his actions, and how he treats others. Mocking someone weakens you. Lifting someone, even silently, shows true strength. The guests were astonished. Even some of the other staff peeked from the kitchen, unable to believe what was happening. The arrogant billionaire, who had once commanded laughter and attention, now seemed small, unsure, and strangely vulnerable. David paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. The silence was thick, almost tangible. The billionaire's hands twitched on the table. He had never felt this exposed in his life. No business deal, no luxury watch, no private jet could have prepared him for this. Then, David smiled faintly and spoke again. This time in English, just loud enough for everyone at the table to hear. Sometimes, those who think they have the most power are the weakest. And those who appear quiet and humble often carry the greatest strength. A few of the guests started nodding, impressed. Others whispered, admiring David's confidence. The young waiter, once humiliated, was now the center of respect. The tables had completely turned. The billionaire, still struggling to recover, glanced around nervously, realizing that the crowd was no longer on his side. David's gaze met the billionaire's. It was calm, steady, and unyielding. The young waiter had demonstrated patience, intelligence, and composure qualities money could never buy. The audience could feel the shift in energy. The power dynamic had changed completely. Some of the guests who had earlier joined in mocking began clapping softly. Then, others followed. Slowly, the applause grew louder, echoing through the restaurant. The billionaire shifted in his chair, unable to participate. His earlier arrogance dissolved into quiet embarrassment. David nodded politely to the table, acknowledging their recognition without arrogance. He had shown that true strength does not lie in wealth, mocking, or power. It lies in knowledge, preparation, and the courage to stand tall in the face of humiliation. Finally, he stepped back, allowing the billionaire a moment to collect himself. The young waiter's calm, composed manner had completely reversed the situation. The billionaire had gone from predator to humbled observer. And the guests, once entertained by mockery, were now fully captivated by the cleverness and dignity of a man they had underestimated. As David walked away from the table, the room seemed to follow him with their eyes. Whispers of admiration and respect spread quietly among the guests. The young waiter had not just defended himself, he had turned the entire situation upside down, proving that intelligence, skill, and composure are far more powerful than money or arrogance. The lesson was clear. And for the billionaire, it was painfully unforgettable. The restaurant had grown unusually quiet. The previous laughter, mocking the young waiter, was now a distant memory. Every eye followed David as he moved gracefully away from the billionaire's table. His posture was calm, his face serene, yet the weight of his words lingered like a quiet storm. The billionaire sat frozen, a mixture of shock and reluctant admiration painting his features. He had faced arrogance before, wealth before, power before, but never intelligence so calm, so deliberate, so unexpected. He wanted to recover, to laugh it off, but the room no longer supported him. The guests were no longer on his side. They had shifted their attention, their respect, to the young waiter. David paused for a moment near the kitchen, pretending to straighten his uniform. Behind the polite motion, a quiet smile tugged at his lips. He did not gloat, he did not boast. Humility and dignity were his allies, and in them, he had claimed victory without raising his voice or insulting anyone. Some of the guests, who had previously laughed at the billionaire's mockery, began whispering among themselves. "Did you hear how he spoke?" one asked quietly. "He's incredible," another replied. They underestimated him completely. David turned slightly, noticing the whispers, and nodded politely. It was a small gesture, but it carried a profound message. Confidence and humility together command respect. The billionaire finally tried to speak. I did not expect. His words faltered. He attempted a weak smile, but it lacked the arrogance that had once defined him. David met his gaze calmly, not with revenge, but with quiet assertion. Every movement, every glance said, "I am unshaken, I am prepared, and I am dignified." The room's atmosphere had shifted completely. The tension that once humiliated David had transformed into admiration, awe, and even a little envy. Guests began clapping softly, uncertain at first. Then, one by one, the applause grew louder. It wasn't mockery. It wasn't forced. It was genuine, a celebration of intelligence, courage, and composure in the face of humiliation. The billionaire looked around, noticing the reaction of the guests. His expression was a mix of embarrassment and reluctant respect. The young waiter had done something no wealth, no status, no arrogance could ever accomplish. He had claimed moral and intellectual victory with nothing but his calm confidence and preparation. David nodded to the guests politely, acknowledging their applause without arrogance. Every step he took as he moved away from the table was measured, dignified, and deliberate. He had won not through confrontation or anger, but through wisdom, knowledge, and patience. Even the kitchen staff, who had watched from the shadows, whispered their admiration. "He handled it perfectly," one said. "He didn't need to shout or fight back." "He's a true example of strength," another added quietly. The billionaire, meanwhile, leaned back in his chair, a rare humility in his posture. For the first time, he felt the weight of underestimating someone who had quietly prepared, someone who had turned humiliation into triumph. He realized that mocking others does not make a man powerful. It only exposes weakness. David finally returned to the kitchen, where the staff greeted him quietly, nodding in respect. His calm smile never wavered. He had faced public humiliation, but now he had proven something far greater. Intelligence, skill, and dignity can outshine arrogance and wealth every time. The applause from the dining room continued, faintly at first, then louder, spreading like a wave through the restaurant. It was not just for David, it was for courage, for patience, for the quiet strength that few could see, but everyone could feel. The billionaire, still seated, could only watch as the young waiter's calm victory left a lasting impression on everyone present. David's lesson was clear and unforgettable. True strength is not in wealth, in laughter, or in mockery. It is in preparation, humility, and the courage to remain calm when others seek to belittle you. The young waiter had turned humiliation into triumph, quietly, elegantly, and definitively. The applause echoed through the restaurant, slowly fading as the guests returned to their conversations. Yet, a different kind of energy lingered in the air, a quiet respect that could not be bought or mocked away. David, the young black waiter, moved through the room with calm confidence, his steps measured, his demeanor composed. He had faced public humiliation, yet he now carried a victory far greater than any wealth or status could provide. In the kitchen, his co-workers watched him quietly, a mixture of admiration and pride in their eyes. Some whispered softly, "He handled it perfectly," while others simply shook their heads in disbelief. David smiled faintly, not out of arrogance, but with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had turned insult into lesson. He leaned against the counter for a moment, catching his breath. The memory of the billionaire's mocking words still lingered, but they no longer held power. The young waiter had shown that preparation, knowledge, and dignity could transform even the most humiliating moment into a triumph. A fellow chef, curious, asked softly, "David, how did you stay so calm? How did you do it?" David's eyes twinkled slightly. "I prepared," he said simply. "I knew that knowledge can never be taken away. And I learned that humility is a strength, not a weakness. The world tests us in ways we never expect. Sometimes we face mockery, insult, or doubt. But how we respond, that is where real power lies." Outside, the restaurant lights reflected off the windows, casting a warm glow. The billionaire remained at his table, still unsettled. His arrogance had been stripped away, replaced with a quiet humility. He had learned, perhaps for the first time, that wealth and power do not guarantee respect. Only character and wisdom can earn it. David picked up a small notepad from the counter, straightened his apron, and glanced toward the dining room. Some of the guests were watching him with renewed interest. They had witnessed something rare. A young man who had been mocked, laughed at, and underestimated, yet had emerged with poise, dignity, and respect. He walked toward the exit, the restaurant buzzing quietly around him. The lesson he carried was simple but profound. Never underestimate someone quietly preparing behind the scenes. Knowledge, patience, and composure are more powerful than wealth, arrogance, or mockery. In the kitchen, a few staff members smiled knowingly. They had always seen David's dedication, his quiet determination, and now the world had seen it too. The applause, the whispers, and the stunned expressions of the guests were a small reflection of what true strength looked like: calm, composed, and intelligent. David paused by the doorway, glancing back one last time at the dining room. The billionaire's face, still pale but thoughtful, caught his eye. There was no hatred, no anger, only a silent acknowledgement of the lesson learned. The young waiter nodded slightly, and the billionaire, for the first time, returned a small respectful nod in response. As David stepped out of the restaurant, the warm evening air brushed against his face. He felt a deep sense of satisfaction, not for defeating someone, but for standing strong, remaining true to himself, and proving that preparation and dignity always matter. The world could mock, doubt, and challenge him, but he had shown that with knowledge, courage, and humility, even the most difficult moments could be transformed into triumphs. That night, the story of the young waiter who had faced humiliation and emerged victorious spread quietly among the staff and guests. It became more than just a tale of clever words. It became a lesson in character, respect, and inner strength. David's quiet smile lingered as he walked into the night, leaving behind a restaurant full of astonished guests and a billionaire who had learned an unforgettable lesson. Humiliation had become victory. Mockery had become respect. And in the end, the lesson was clear. True power is silent, steady, and always prepared.